Good evening. Hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. My name is Travis Smith. I'm an associate professor of religion and philosophy here at Central. Welcome to the 15th annual FLIR lecture. This lecture series is generously funded by Dr. Gilbert FLIR and his wife Ruth. Dr. FLIR was an assistant professor of religion here at Central from 1959 to 1965. He went on to serve as a United Methodist counselor, where he counseled young adults in some in unconventional settings. The FLIR's strong support for leadership training led them to fund the Gil and Ruth FLIR Fund for Excellence in Value-Based Learning, or Value-Based Education at CMU. On behalf of the Religion Department, or the Religion and Philosophy Department, I should say, and Central Methodist University, I would like to thank the FLIRs for their continued support and generosity. There were several people involved in making this event happen tonight. I'd like to thank Dr. Bill Sheehan, Deanna Cooper, and Cindy Rogan from Advancement and Alumni Relations, Brian Adams and Patrick Gittemeyer from Student Development. I also thank Joe Wayner and Emily Kessel from Office of Marketing and Communications, Sharon Cravens and her kitchen staff, Provost Rita Goldstad, President Roger Drake, and my colleagues in the Humanities Division, especially Dr. Kevin Carnahan and Dr. Daryl Jeffries. I'd also like to thank each of you for joining us tonight. I would ask that you please silence your cell phones, any noise that could occur unwanted. After the lecture, we will have time for questions, and this will be followed by a reception with cookies. So please stick around for that. All right. It is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Tao Jiang. I first met Tao some 20 years ago when I was a graduate student at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. Tao was a young scholar just beginning his career. As my professor, he introduced me to Chinese philosophy and encouraged me to study the Chinese language. His mentorship and friendship has had a major impact on my life, and for that, I'm extremely grateful. The great Chinese philosopher Confucius once remarked, quote, "Isn't it a joy to have friends come from afar?" End quote. Tonight, I'm experiencing that joy. Tao is professor of religion and philosophy at Rutgers University, New Brunswick, New Jersey. He holds a joint appointment in both the religion department and the philosophy department. He specializes in classical Chinese philosophy and Mahayana Buddhist philosophy. His most recent book, Origins of Moral Political Philosophy in Early China, which he worked on here and there for some 15 years, published by Oxford University Press in 2021. It has received the 2023 Joseph Levinson Prize Honorable Mention from the Association for Asian Studies. Tao is also the director of Rutgers Center for Chinese Studies and the co-chair of the Neo-Confucian Studies Seminar at Columbia University. So please welcome Dr. Tao Jiang.
Travis, for that lovely introduction, and I want to thank everybody for being here tonight. I want to thank everybody who makes tonight's presentation possible. So I'm going to talk tonight about a figure and a topic that's dear and near to my heart, and this is from two chapters in the book that Travis mentioned, Origins of Moral Political Philosophy in Early China, and this is Zhuangzi. I will talk more about him in just a minute. So the topic tonight is Zhuangzi and the tragedy or personal freedom in Chinese history. And you'll see the very signature image of Zhuangzi. This is somebody who's just lying around in the wilderness and dreamed that he was a butterfly. This is the very sort of iconic image representation of the Zhuangzi. So here's the outline. I'm gonna talk briefly about some philosophical tropes, like certain paradigms of philosophy that we use, and quite often sort of unconsciously we employ those kind of paradigms in our philosophical reasoning, and then connect that with Zhuangzi. And then I'll talk about the early Chinese understanding of the world, or metaphysics in some ways. I will emphasize on the understanding of early Chinese relationality and change. Because the Zhuangzi's conception of personal freedom is framed within this pure understanding of the world. And then I'll talk about the Confucians and the Zhuangzi, their different attitudes towards relationality and change. And then I'll delve into what I think are two spaces of personal freedom in the text called Zhuangzi, named after the author. Then personal freedom, I'll talk more about it. It's defined as appreciation, cultivation, and exploration of personal space, wherein one can be left alone and enjoying the company of like-minded friends or family, without being entangled in the social political world amidst constant and often unpredictable changes. You can see the entanglement, the relationality aspect, and the sort of change that's very much sort of factored into the way that Zhuangzi think about personal freedom. And then at the end, I'll talk about the viewer as well as the limit of this Zhuangzi approach to personal freedom and its tragic fate in Chinese history. So I'm going to start with this very famous story in the Republic, in Plato's Republic. Probably all of you are familiar with the story. This is the fable of a frog and a whale. I mean, no, sorry. This is the in the Zhuangzi. Okay, so the other one is okay. Sorry. So this is actually a famous fable of frog in a whale in the Zhuangzi, and there's several versions of it. And one of the most famous versions is in the Zhuangzi in the text. You can see here is, we see a frog, who is enjoying himself, right, in this little well, and then at the outside, you can see the head of a sea turtle, who stepped in, who really was asking, they were having a conversation between the frog and the sea turtle. So, and the frog was really, describing what a marvelous life and how great everything is in his well. And when the sea turtle described to the frog what it was like in his abode, right, in this, seemingly limitless, sort of ocean, this grand ocean, then the frog didn't know what to make of it. It was just so out of the ordinary for the frog. They didn't know what to think about the story. So that's one story. And the other one is the famous allegory of the cave in Plato's Republic. Most all of you are probably familiar with the story, where in the Republic, we're invited to imagine the world, right, in this fashion, as if we live in this cave. That there are these people who are chained against the wall, and with their face just facing the another wall, and then they could only see what's being projected from behind them, right? There's the fire, that there's some animals and objects that's being then projected onto the wall, and these people who were chained with their head chained, they could only see what's going on in that wall, in the sort of the shadow, and right, and so then without really knowing what they were seeing was not really the real thing, was just an illusion, was the shadow of what's being projected from behind them, until they, unless they can actually break free from that chain and then turn around, make this turn to really face the source, the real object, which is what's behind them. And then the ultimate source of all that would, of course, be the sun that's outside the cave. So this was supposed to be the sort of the way that we, as ordinary humans, that's kind of our world. I remember when I first, came across this story, in undergrad. I didn't find this story intuitive at all. It was like, why do we come up with such a sort of a really complicated, sort of, apparatus to really conceptualize the world? Anyway, but it's had a profound impact in the West about shaping the Western understanding of metaphysics, of ethics, right, aesthetics, and so forth. So it's a really powerful allegory. Whereas the fable of frog was also very influential in sort of shaping the Chinese understanding of the world. What's interesting about the contrast between the fable and the allegory is that in the cave, we see that the primary setup is illusion versus reality, or ignorance versus knowledge, right? I mean, it's clearly in the cave, in the allegory of the cave is a problematic situation versus in the sort of versus the the world that's represented by by the sun and so forth. So the primary setup is illusion versus reality that they were privy to. Was only the prisoners were, they could only see the illusion, the shadows, and they were of course in a state of ignorance. Whereas by contrast, the primary setup in the whale was actually between what's limited and what's limitless, right? The limited world of the whale versus the limitless world of the ocean, and the smallness versus capaciousness. Okay, so, and it's important how what's problematic is portrayed. The limitation that's experienced supposedly by the frog, it's not an illusion. It's just small, but it's not fake, it's not unreal, right? Whereas what those prisoners experienced in the cave, it was not the real thing at all. It was completely illusory, right? So this is a really important distinction in terms of how problematic situation is sort of conceptualized within those kind of paradigm. Now, to overcome the kind of limitation that's portrayed in the whale, is to try to be expansive and to be open-minded. So then, how you try to be expansive, to be open-minded, is to then you learn, and that learning process, through learning, you become much more expansive and more capacious, right? To become more knowledgeable and so on and so forth. And the learning is a gradual process of accumulation, gradual expansion of your horizon. And, so you eventually grow from the whale to, hopefully to be more encompassing. Now, but in the story of the cave, however, to overcome illusion, by accumulating more illusion, you're not going to get reality, right? So the fundamental sort of setup is very different. What's required for learning in the cave is actually you are required to turn towards the source. And that's not an expensive process. That requires a fundamental reorientation of our cognitive apparatus. So in some ways, the learning in that situation is almost a conversion, that it completely reorients our understanding of our position in the world. So this is really, that has really profound implications in terms of how we understand sort of our situation in the world, our nature of the world, our, the sort of our ethics and so on and so forth. So, and if you really play out how these paradigms gets sort of played out in the history of philosophy in China and in the West, broadly speaking, then you can see how profound these, the stories gets to be played out. Using different vocabulary, of course, but you can see the very fundamental tension is really there. Okay, so now we move to Zhuangzi. This is somebody who lived in 3rd century BCE. I mean, the dating is a little fuzzy, but I'm going to stick to 3rd century BCE. This was a period of profound disunity and chaos and violence. And this is what's known as, towards the end of what's known as the Warring States period. I mean, from the title of that period, Warring States, not a pleasant, period to live in, although it's a great period to study. I mean, usually the great period to study is not a great period to live in. That's the sort of the tragedy of our history, because they're really fascinating stuff that's going on. So, and Zhuangzi and Confucians were the mainstream thinkers. And the Zhuang and the Mohists were, I'm not going to talk too much about Confucian and Mohists. I'm just going to say that Zhuangzi, he mocked the Confucian and the Mohists for being like frogs in a well, meaning that they were just too limited. Imagine that he didn't say that they were just illusion, that they were trapped by illusion, but rather they were too limited. And rather, Zhuangzi extolled the virtue of roaming in the world of limitlessness, like the seeker, right? And I'm gonna catch this in terms of the personal freedom that we'll talk about. For Zhuangzi, this Confucian and Mohists were limited by their narrowly moralistic perspective on everything, whereas Zhuangzi wants to sort of overcome their limitation. So for those who are not familiar with Zhuangzi, I'll just talk very briefly about a famous story about Zhuangzi. Here is a very famous story and famous butterfly dream. That famously, he had a dream that he was a butterfly, and just having a good time, and then he woke up, and then he realized, oh, he was dreaming. But then, being Zhuangzi, he then thought, wait, was I dreaming that I was a butterfly, or am I actually the butterfly who now dreaming that I'm Zhuangzi? Right? So he get into that. It was an interesting sort of thought experiment, at least, in saying that maybe our reality is actually more fluid. There's no sort of fixed point that we can say, oh, this is what it is supposed to be, right? It's rather the sort of the radicality of change that's involved in the story is quite fascinating. Okay, so that's one of the signature story in the Zhuangzi. And the other one is a story about a useless tree. Now there's several versions of the story in the text. That one story goes like there was the tree, and there was this carpenter who walked by the tree, and he saw the tree was just gnarling around, and so it doesn't conform to any sort of shape, and being a carpenter, I mean, wood, if it's a wood, a tree which very straight, what would be very useful for a carpenter as to build furniture and housing, right? For build houses. But then for a tree that doesn't conform to any measurement, that's kind of useless. But then he went home. He had a dream about this tree. So they were having a conversation in the dream about the supposed uselessness of the tree. So the tree was basically telling the carpenter, "Oh, you thought I'm useless. Look at all those useful trees. How long do they get to live? They'll all be cut down before they reach maturity because they conform. They were very useful, so they can be employed for these they can be cut down for buildings, for all kinds of other purposes. Whereas I'm just having a good time, enjoy a good life." Okay, so this is another. You can see that the Zhuangzi is a really interesting kind of text. It takes on very, very, very unconventional kind of perspectives on everything. Okay, so and there are lots of implications that can be explored from these stories, but we can address some of these later on. All right, so I'm going to briefly say to contextualize what exactly is Zhuangzi doing, right? So I'm going to talk about here briefly the mainstream moral political project in early China. This is from the 5th to the 3rd century BCE. This is the foundational period of Chinese moral political philosophy, and so foundational that people even now just constantly sort of appeal to that period. And they were just sort of formative in terms of shaping the Chinese moral political outlook. In a way that it's even more important, than, like, let's say, the Greeks to later Western history. This is quite an extraordinary. So the Confucian and the Mohists, they were the dominant players in this early period, in the early moral political debate about how to build an orderly and fulfilling world amid increasing chaos and violence in this war and states period, right? This is the war and states period that I just briefly mentioned. And so the mainstream debate was a contestation between two conceptions of moral obligations. One, humaneness, the other is justice. Humaneness is a partialist conception of moral obligation embraced by the Confucian, partially meaning that it's, we start with, we are partial to those who are close to us, especially our family. And then we gradually expand that kind of partialism to be more encompassing. But then we always start with, what's close to us, and then to be more expansive. So this is the partialist orientation and the sort of the filial piety, that kind of value. You can see why that's so central in this kind of picture. And justice in this case is impartialist, meaning that it's the state of the state of affairs or the merits of a person should be adjudicated regardless of the status or relationship this person has to the adjudicating agent. So and this is the kind of impartialist conception or moral obligation that's advocated by the Maoists and others. And so these are the mainstream debate between these two sides, with different thinkers line up differently. And of course, there are also other kinds of sort of contestation. Now, Zhuangzi was a singular exception to this debate. He was a strong advocate for personal freedom, and but he was deeply ambivalent about how to engage the state. And his personal freedom was a challenge to the centrality of this ritual norm, and I'll talk more about that later. Embraced in the Confucian construction of the world, this sort of constricting well in this fable, right? So this for the Zhuangzi, the Confucians were living like the well like the frog in the well, and the well is this construction by ritual practices and ritual norms. Okay, and his musing about personal freedom had to negotiate these boundaries and rules that's set by the ubiquitous ritual. Now, ritual, in a contemporary and especially American context, it's kind of a dirty word. It's not great, but in the history of religion, ritual is extraordinarily. It's hard to think that anything else is more important than ritual. The way that ritual plays in the formation of human community. Okay, so Zhuangzi was a critique of that. Now I'm going to start talking about the early Chinese understanding of the world. Remember that this is how Zhuangzi's conception of personal freedom will be framed within such an understanding of the world. The first is relationality. Relationality means that things in the world, including humans, or especially humans, are intrinsically related to each other. So our relationship to each other is not incidental to us as humans, but it's intrinsic, that we cannot really survive without these kind of relationalities. And family relationship being the most prominent one that's highlighted in the tradition. However, what makes Zhuangzi interesting is that he tends to highlight the perilous aspect of relationality. So here's the famous story in the text where Zhuangzi saw a cicada was about to be preyed upon by a mantis who itself was oblivious to its own imminent danger of being attacked by a magpie. But then the magpie itself did not realize it was the target of a bird catcher, with the latter in each pair taking advantage of the former's unawareness. It's a series of interconnectedness with the former about to attack the latter, to be attacked by the latter. So when Zhuangzi saw this, he was really alarmed. He was depressed for 3 months, right? He said, wow, things are really inherently tied to each other, such that they cause up upon each other. Now, if we study the text, the Zhuangzi text that I'm talking about, you can see there are many expressions of what I call Xiang expression. Xiang in Chinese, it means mutual. So here's so many expressions of mutuality, in the way that things are related to each other. So mutual stabbing, that's fun, right? Crushing each other, prevailing over each other, kicking each other, mutual suspicion, mutual deception, faulting each other, ridiculing each other, pushing each other, and disturbing each other. Just a great picture of relationality in the Zhuangzi. And this is what makes Zhuangzi interesting, that he tends to focus on these really perilous aspects of relationality. However, there are two interesting exceptions. One is spitting moisture at each other. I'll explain what this means. The other is soaking each other in the foam. But they're also problematic. But here's the story. This is where these two expressions appears. In Zhuangzi, it says, when the spring dries up, the fish are stranded together on land. Imagine, there's no water now. Fish stranded on land. So they spit moisture at each other and soak each other in the foam, right, in order to survive, right? Because they need, sort of the moisture and water to survive. But then they're stranded. How do they survive? They just spit moisture and then soak each other in each other. I mean, it doesn't sound like an attractive picture, but that's really the point. That's the nature of their trying to help each other in order to survive in a really, really nasty and perilous kind of circumstances, right? But they would be better off forgetting each other in the Yangtze River or in the lake. So he says, I'm going to skip this. He says, fish forget all about each other in the Yangtze River and the lakes, and the men forget about each other in the lore of the way. Okay, so you see the spitting moisture at each other and soaking each other in the foam. Again, they are expressions of mutual help and mutual assistance. And that's kind of with a more positive import, right? But it's still not as good as forgetting each other. That's really the only positive expressions of mutuality in the text. How to be mutual is to forget, to mutually forget. It's just great. I mean, that's the degree to which Zhuangzi is skeptical towards the kind of relationship, towards relationality, right? Does that ring a bell with some people? Maybe. Okay. And so that's one aspect, relationship, relationality, that we're intrinsically related to each other, and Zhuangzi is very troubled by that. The second aspect of the nature of the world is change. Change is inevitable. It's universal, right? So from the very beginning of the Zhuangzi, the first chapter, roaming with ease, it starts with this transformation, very dramatic transformation of a huge fish transformed into a humongous bird, right? I mean, that's from the get-go. It just, takes us into a sort of almost an altered kind of universe. And of course, the butterfly dream is another example of the mutual transformation, right, between Zhuangzi and the butterfly. And death is probably the most radical change that constitutes really a dangerous and incomprehensible disruption of the human world. These are aspects of changes that we see highlighted in the Zhuangzi. Now, so the Confucians and the Zhuangists, they have very different kinds of approach and attitudes towards relationship, to relationality, and change. So the Confucians, which again is the mainstream, represent the mainstream Chinese approach, they appeal to ritual, I'll talk more about that, to nurture relationality and to manage change, right? So they emphasize the nurturing aspect of relationship, especially family relationship, through ritual practices. So if you have a good familial relationship, that's very nurturing. And that's the aspect that the Confucians tend to emphasize regarding relationality. Towards change, the Confucian, for example, funeral is the most sacred ritual occasions in one's life. So one carefully prescribed funeral rituals help the mourners cope with the devastating loss and to preserve the integrity of family relationship. Again, it's to set up very detailed, prescribed, sort of rituals in order to control and manage the damage that's caused by a devastating loss in a family or community, right? So that's how Confucians and how they approached relationality and change. For Zhuangzi, his attitude towards relationality, we just talked about, just now, right? These lovely mutual expressions, right? that he tends to emphasize the entangled aspect of relationality. And he actually, what he wants to do is to cultivate a personal space within which one can enjoy a high degree of autonomy and independence, and occasionally hang out with non-burdening friends. So that's for his idea of relationality is the one. If you can somehow cultivate the kind of space to be left alone, and occasionally you hang out with people who don't, really bother each other. And his attitude towards change is celebrating the wonders of the world and the unpredictability of the transformations. And he often is very critical of the narrowness and the limitation of this Confucian approach that was portrayed earlier. Now, here's one famous description in the text where he describes the birth, life and death, right? Is that the hugest clumps of soil loaded me with a body, had me toiling through life, ease me with old age, rest me with death. Right? You think of death as rest. Therefore, that I found it good to live is the very reason why I found it good to die. If today a master swordsmith were smelting metal, then the metal would jump up and say, I insist on being made into an Excalibur. The swordsmith would surely think the metal, it was just, it was a curse. If now, having once happened on the shape of a man, I were to say, I'll be a man, nothing but a man. He that fashions and transforms us, like the God figure, would surely think me a faithful son of a man. Now, if once and for all, I think of heaven and earth as a vast foundry, and the fashioner and the transformer as the master smith, wherever I am going, why should I object? I will fall into a sound sleep and wake up fresh. And that's how he sees life, the cycle of life and death. Right? So there's always a celebratory component. Okay. So after all the discussion about the sort of understanding Zhuangzi and pretty much classical Chinese understanding of the nature of the world, relationality, and change, now I'm going to go into discussing two spaces of personal freedom in the text. So given that picture of the world, how does he conceptualize spaces for personal freedom? And there are two expressions in the text. One is called fang nei, and the other is called fang wai. Now, the fang, I translate that as ritually constituted and regulated world. Okay, so what's a ritual? Ritual was a system of rules, codes, and conventions that regulate every aspect of human life in early China, not just early China, actually throughout Chinese history. From sacred funeral rituals to mundane daily routines, from the solemn state ritual of sacrifice to heaven to the ordinary personal interactions, it would eventually become a marker that distinguished the civilized people who abide by those rituals from the so-called barbarians who did not. The Zhuangzi's musing about personal freedom really negotiate the boundaries that and the rules that's set by this world that's constituted and regulated by the ubiquitous ritual. Right? We might think that we can live without ritual, but you try it. It's actually super duper hard. Even in our contemporary American society, that the ubiquity of ritual, in some ways that we don't think about, in the way that we interact with each other, it's if you go to a different culture, then you will realize how deeply ingrained certain of our ritual practices are, because we don't think of them as ritual. But then when you encounter people from another culture, then all of a sudden you realize, oh, actually, there are lots of rules, but even though they're not always articulated. Okay, so let me talk about the fang nei and fang wai, because these are critical terms in the text. So the distinction between the fang nei, so this is fang nei meaning nei is inside, right? So So this is Fang Nei is inside the ritually constituted world, and Fang Wai meaning outside the ritually constituted world. So, and this distinction was actually made by Confucius in the text. Remember that I just mentioned that Zhuangzi was pretty much making a mockery of Confucians all the time, but here, I mean, Zhuangzi was using Confucius to make a very important point. So the image of Confucius in the text, in the Zhuangzi, is actually quite complicated, and it's actually an interesting subject all unto itself. So Confucius asked a disciple, Zigong, to inquire about the funeral arrangement for a master Shanghu who has recently died, because he, when the Confucius sort of entourage passed through, a place that they saw that there's somebody died, and then there are a bunch of people, a bunch of friends who were just singing and dancing around, a dead body. So Confucius sent his disciple to ask, so what kind of funeral arrangement are you guys going to do about your friend's dead body, right? But Zigong, the disciple, was roundly mocked by Shanghu's friends, and this Zigong, being the disciple of Confucius, he was very puzzled and turned to Confucius. So what's going on? So he was like, what kind of people are they, right? They don't have any decorum of behavior, treat the bones of their own bodies as external to themselves, sing with a corpse right next to them with no change in facial expressions. I don't know what to call them. These are just crazy people, right? What kind of people do that? Confucius sighed, said, they are the sorts who roam outside the life world, the Fang Wai. I am of the kind who roam inside this life world, the Fang Nei. Outside and inside don't overlap. It was silly of me to send you to more. It's like, my bad, right? So I should have known better. These are the people that these ritual norms means exactly nothing to them. And they play by their own rules, in other words. And they're the companions of heaven and earth. And we're the one, you and me, are the ones who abide by these ritual norms. So those who don't belongs to the Fang Wai, right, outside. And those who abide by the ritual norms are the Fang Nei people, those inside the ritual norm. Now, according to the Book of Rites, this is a famous companion of rituals in early China, a very famous Confucian text. In order to show respect to the departed, to the dead, right, family members should wail for 3 days, not eat for 3 days, and not wash their hair for 3 months. And sons should mourn for their parents for 3 years with detailed prescriptions about when and how to do or what to do during those 3-year period. And these are, canonical texts, right? So there's actually a pretty rigid norm that governs the world according to the Confucians, and it should be, because this is the way that you should deal with death, especially death of a parent, which is a grave occasion. So, and as I mentioned, that it's one of the most sacred occasions for the Confucians, funeral ritual. And if you violate it, it's such a blasphemy, right? It's not. You are not even human in the Confucian sense. But of course, the Zhuangists, they don't buy this ritual. No, remember the frog and the whale, right? For Zhuangzi, that kind of practice is where they're too limited by this constricting whale. So for Zhuangzi, there are two kinds of Fang. So I'm talking about first. I'm going to start with Fang Wai, the roaming outside the ritually constituted world. The Fang Wai, this is roaming at the margin of the life world. There are two kinds of Fang Wai. One is the normative Fang Wai. It's like outside, those who do things conduct themselves outside the ritual norms. That's the normative Fang Wai. The other will be physical Fang Wai. Will be in the text. You can see a lot of portrays of of people who dwell in mountains or on rivers, and these are traditionally understood as these sort of hermetic spaces, right? These are hermits who who live apart from the human world, who have their own, who have their own rules and who are sort of disappointed, by the world. And that's the kind of space that Zhuangzi captures. So you can see a lot of portraits or imagination of a hermetic life in the Zhuangzi. And so this kind of picture, the Fang Wai, is a great challenge to the ritual order and norm. Now, Zhuangzi, he resists this ritualization that everything in the world has to be ritualized, has to abide by a certain norm. Zhuangzi just ridicule this kind of mind-numbing and suffocating ritual norms and dismissing this ossification of genuine disposition into dogmatic moralization. That's the Zhuangzi's position. That it's fine to have genuine expression. Why do we have to follow these prescribed, detailed sort of norms in order for genuine expressions? And this vision offers the Chinese intellectuals an alluring alternative to dominant political and intellectual imagination. Okay, so that's Fang Wai freedom, right? That's roaming at the margin or outside the ritually constituted world. The other one is Fang Mei. This is freedom as roaming within the ritually constituted world. And this is the kind of freedom that negotiates the constraint within while living in the world, in the ritually constituted world. So what do? Which is, of course, most people, right? How do you do that? Zhuangzi, again through the mouth of Confucius, lays out two ultimate and inescapable constraints in living in such a world. And those constraints would be valid even for the Zhuangzi, which is destiny and duty. Destiny refers to one's filial obligations to one's parents. We're born into a certain family and we're obligated to be filial towards our parents. We have no choice in this. And even Zhuangzi sort of say, okay, all right, we have no choice. The second one would be duty, which means the minister's obligation to serve his Lord, if according. That's according to Confucius and Zhuangzi to some extent to some extent agree, but then he would disagree at other parts of the text. At least he was ambivalent. And so this is his way to navigate this ritually constituted life world whose norms are governed by the commitment to filial piety and the obligation to serve the state in these two sort of ultimate constraints. And so now I'm going to get into this famous, really probably the most famous story, one of the most, there's so many famous stories. This is the most famous story about a butcher who is trying to cut open an ox. Now, here he said, butcher, this is a butcher, right? Who was cutting up an ox for Lord Wen Hui. At every touch of his hand, every heave of his shoulder, every move of his feet, every thrust of his knee, he slithered his knife along the zane, and all was in perfect rhythm, as if he were performing some grand ritual. Okay, so what's interesting that this Cook Ding, the famous butcher Ding story, it offers the most illuminating example for this distinct Zhuangzi's approach to personal freedom within the confines of the life world. Now, what's his execution? His execution of this cutting was exquisite and precise, and he's hitting all the right notes, while smoothly cutting open the ox body without hacking his way through. And he turned out to be quite a philosopher. Here, in the Zhuangzi, what's fascinating is that he would make these traditionally lowly, those who are in the lower echelon of the society, and he would elevate them to be his spokesperson, right? Unlike sort of the Confucians or the others who are more respectful of the hierarchy, in the Zhuangzi, usually we see these more marginalized kind of voices, the disabled, women or other, or people who are from much lower sort of echelon of the society. The butcher, for example. Now, he would explain to this awestruck Lord Wenhui that, he cares more about the Tao, the way, the right way to do things. He described the different phases of learning the craft of butchery in terms of different perceptions that become available to him as he deepens his knowledge of the ox body. So at the very beginning, he would actually have to hack his way through because he didn't really understand the intricate structure of the bone and the muscle pattern of the ox body, and then gradually he will learn to understand the ox body much more intimately. That he was able to run his chopper through these invisible spaces inside the muscle and bone and joints of the ox body, as if there was nothing there. He could explore these hidden spaces without hacking his way through at all. So therefore, he hasn't changed his chopper for 19 years, whereas even a good chopper would have to change theirs every year, right? So this is one really extraordinarily skillful sort of chopper. So what's really extraordinary is that he describes how the discovery of these hidden paths inside the ox body, which enable him to run the chopper more gracefully and effectively. He quote, "At that joint, there is an interval, and the chopper's edge has no thickness." That it's as if the chopper has no thickness, right? If you insert what has no thickness where there is an interval, then what more could you ask? Of course, there is ample room to move the edge about. So it's rather extraordinary that he had this extraordinary discernment of a space in a joint that's usually not available to us untrained eyes, right? That he was able to explore those kind of spaces. And so what's interesting here, for the purpose of this presentation and the purpose of my book, is that Lord Wenhui said, "Oh, I now learned how to nurture life," right? In his witness of this performance of butchery. I mean, how does butchery have to do with the nurturing of life, right? That's a very striking image. What I think what's going on here, so this story is usually touted as one of those really still stories in the text. And what I think is going on is that this is a deeply political story. That the ox is actually a metaphor for the intricacy and complexity of this ritually constituted world. The bones and the joints symbolize the rules and norms of such a world that should not be violated. So you have to actually navigate your way through. If you violate those, then you're going to be injured or even get killed. So the Zhuangzi can find the path of least resistance in accompanying what one sets out to do when navigating the world. That's similar to the butcher who can discern a space between joints when running his chopper. This person can navigate the world without having to force their way through by exploring routes and ways invisible and unavailable to most people. Okay, so here's the last slide. I'm going to talk about the sort of the attraction as well as the limitation of this strongest picture and imagination of personal freedom. Now, his antipathy towards moral monopoly, social conformity, and political tyranny is pretty evident. Anybody who reads it, anybody who wants to read a Chinese philosophical text or any literary text, this is the text to read. He sought salvation in the personal and imagined space of freedom that's radically different and separate from the social political domain. A Zhuangzi, right, the follower of a Zhuangzi, can roam freely, both inside and outside such a ritually constituted world, equipped with a very extraordinary and discerning heart and mind through their discernment and skill. Unfortunately, for most of us who do not, possess such a discerning heart mind and exceptional skill, such coveted personal space would simply be unavailable or inaccessible. This points to the limitation of the Zhuangzi imagination of personal freedom, especially in relation to the state. In Chinese history, the Zhuangzi ideal of personal freedom was internalized and marginalized. On the one hand, Zhuangzi's exploration of personal freedom led to the invention of interiority in Chinese intellectual history. For Zhuangzi, the heart, mind, and the life world should follow different norms, and the Zhuangzi's heart mind is attuned to the Tao that transcends the confines of ritual norm. On the other hand, this internalization, so this freedom is internalized, it becomes the inner dimension of the heart mind, and the marginal or exited to the hermetic space, to the margin of the social political world. So this internalization and marginalization of personal freedom in Chinese history meant that it did not exert much impact on the development of a native Chinese imagination of a political freedom when engaging with the state. For those who want to get away from politics, like hermits, or those who were prevented from pursuing their political, ambitions, those losers in pursuing their political ambitions, the Zhuangzi was their counsel, right? If you are not successful, or if you're just tired of stuff, then you read Zhuangzi. Other than that, the Zhuangzi was not a major voice in Chinese political discourse, especially the political discourse on freedom, where it could have the most impact. And they regarded freedom as a private endeavor, not as a political institution or collective effort. Consequently, it was left to each person to cultivate a personal freedom, personal space, in order to enjoy some degree of personal freedom within the life world, or to stay out of it. It is a tragedy of historic proportion that the Zhuangzi approach to freedom, especially his imagination of personal freedom within the ritually constituted world, was not factored into the way the state was conceived and designed, both at the time when the text was composed and subsequently in Chinese history. It did not occur to the Zhuangist followers of Zhuangzi that we can, through institutional arrangement, constrain the state's ability to intrude upon people's personal freedom. How the Zhuangist imagination of personal freedom can be integrated into the Chinese conception of the state remains a daunting challenge for contemporary Chinese thinkers. Thank you very much.
So we do have a few minutes for questions. Do we have any questions from the audience? We need a mic or Kevin's one of the loudest on campus.
Yeah, I can talk out loud. So you've got the story about the people who are going and dancing around instead of properly ritually mourning at the funeral. Right. And then you've got this more kind of accommodationist reading of the cutting of the ox.
Right.
How do you read those two together? Is Zhuangzi condemning the people who didn't obey the rituals at are they misusing their freedom? Or how do you want to read those right next to each other?
Right. So here's where precisely this framework of Fang Nai works, right? So Fang Nai, so those who were not mourning the death of their friend properly, according to at least the Confucian norm, they operate under the Fang Wai. Sort of they have their own sort of liminal space almost. That's how they do it. They sort of almost have a certain sort of celebratory tone to the way that they treat death, right? So they just don't treat death in the way that most of us would treat. That's probably an understatement. But for the cutting of the ox story, the butcher story, that's the operation of that's the funneling operation. So then these is where I think Zhuangzi is really fascinating, that he still, despite his hesitance towards engaging in politics, he used these sort of stories to portray a possibility where people, through their extraordinary cultivation of their skills, of their discerning mind, and were able to create or fashion a personal space that would be accessible only to them, right, to their personal space, not through any sort of collective or political arrangement, that they would only explore that by themselves, or those people who who they invite into that space. And that's where it was very carefully cultivated, and that's much more sort of constrained and cultivated and tamed, as opposed to this wild, kind of a celebratory, sort of almost weird kind of tone when in these the funeral story.
So is there a better or worse? I mean, is there an implied condemnation of the people at the funeral?
No.
It's
There
just-
was,
they're just-
no. They're different. They're people who operate under different registers. So the Zhuangzi allows both. Yeah.
Makes me want to sing. Okay, so well, I've got a practical question, but maybe I'll say it for you afterwards, since we're on the butcher. So if I get this right, what he's describing in our final, the butcher who is the skilled, who has the knife skill, who doesn't even dull his knife as he does this.
Right.
So in a sense, without having to see the construct of society or like the bones, the sinews and so forth, because he's outside, right, working his way in.
No, he's inside.
Yeah, so he's inside, but the knife is now in, so he's moving in the spaces. Basically,
Yeah.
and this is where he's generating the freedom. So he's got the structure that. So this is the juxtaposition you're talking about here. Okay.
Right.
How's he get there? I mean, is this? I mean, we're kind of looking at the end the product.
Sure.
Is he hacking that thing away for millennia? Like he has to start somewhere, right? So does he start dulling knives, and eventually, what does he achieve? A revelation? Does he achieve? How do we get from one to the other?
Right. So after years and years in of practice and very sort of conscientious kind of practice, that you eventually get to that place. But then what I wanted to problematize is that space, however exquisite and however valuable, it was available only to him, right? So it's not available to others, and others we won't see that almost invisible space. And so for him or thinker like him, that they should have think about ways to engage the state such that that space can actually be brought out into the open more through other kind of design of the state in a way that the legalists think about that. But the legalists were the ones who were extraordinarily rigorous when they think about the design and the construction of a state. And the journalists should be participant in that, in designing what an ideal state should be like. But the journalists just they forsake that project. That's what I found to be rather tragic and unfortunate in Chinese history. That if they were more involved, in that, then that would probably brought about a rather different trajectory in Chinese political history. So that kind of freedom becomes sort of spiritual, becomes internal, becomes a sort of the spirit of the heart mind, or becomes a sort of a hermetic space that you just, you enjoy, sort of living at the edges of the social political world. That's the kind of space that Zhuangzi's imagination of personal freedom ends up sort of thriving without having much impact into the way that that political institutions were constructed and designed. And I think the mistake of the Zhuangzi, I mean, not the mistake, but the limitation of Zhuangzi is that they think of personal freedom as personal. in nature, whereas they don't think of freedom as actually as a collective project, as a political institution. That they think that through their own personal cultivation, through their own effort, they can somehow just try to be left alone, but they didn't realize, well, in order to be left alone, you actually have to engage in politics. Not engage in politics, I mean, it does engage in politics, but engage in the design or an imagination or an ideal state, which I think is where that approach falls short.
Any other questions? Comments?
You said that Zhuangzi, he mocks the Confucian view for being like the frog in the well. Does he not think that happiness is attainable by being in the well, by having a limited perspective?
Some parts of the text, he seems to be, sort of conceding that, okay, if you're just happy being a frog in a well, I guess it's okay, right? It's it's not ideal, but he seemed to concede that if people were just perfectly content, living as a frog in a well, that's fine. But then if that's the case, then there's nothing you can do about those people, right? So, but those who actually have an encounter with somebody from outside their world, who brings something that's radically different, and if such a person is open, is curious, and wanting to know, then Zhuangzi would have something for you. If you're perfectly content and you're not interested and curious, then there's nothing he can do, and that's okay for Zhuangzi. That's perfectly okay. Yeah. If you haven't read Zhuangzi, so it's an extraordinary, interesting text to read. And you don't. It's not the kind of text that's usually sort of gets sort of. Yeah.
Thank you again.
Thank you.